Let's spar.
All right, and let's spar. You are my guest. Although today something special has happened. You are the first guest to actually tell me the topics you wanted to spar about. So for round one, I thought I had one free round, so I'm going to give you just a random question that you don't know about.
Let's
but the
do it.
next two rounds after that, we'll do your topics. So this first one is it's related to maybe you being in Thailand can have some insight about this. This picture here is of our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, and the first family visiting India a couple of years ago. And they decided to dress up in traditional Indian garb and then make these spiritual gestures. I don't know what that is, but should that be considered offensive? Is that stepping on some cultural toes, or is imitation the best flattery, as some people say? Now you can go first, or you can let me go first. It's up to you.
I'm happy to go first.
Okay,
I'm gonna take
you get the first minute. The first minute all to yourself. The second minute, I get it all to myself to refute. And then the third minute is what we call the bare knuckle, or the let's spar round. Is now we can interrupt each other, ask questions, and just have a really kind of an assertive but civil back and forth.
I love it.
All right, let's begin.
All right, so I don't think it's offensive to dress up in all the culture's clothing. I think, the saying goes, imitation is the best form of flattery. And this comes with the caveat that you have to do it in a respectful manner. I think this picture is not the best imitation of that. Depends also, we don't know the context behind it, but if a culture accepts that you dress up as a form of respect, let's say it's a traditional ceremony, for example, or, you've seen like multicultural weddings, for example, where, you have the bride and the groom in each other's culturally relevant, clothing and things like that. I think that specifically, when it's accepted and it's tasteful, you almost get permission in a certain sense. I think that is not offensive. I think I wouldn't go that far as to say offensive. It has to be done with a certain level of decorum, for sure.
All right, but who's gonna give permission or take away permission to dress up like this to a visiting dignitary or prime minister from another country? I think he's taking liberties to dress up like this and to get his whole family to dress up like this. And when they do this cultural, kind of the spiritual gesture, it kind of, to me, it seems they're going a little bit too far, because you have to kind of be, part of a culture, part of a religion, and that means something to people when they put their hands together and upward, and they're kind of paying homage to their deity. And so for people to come along and simply it reminds me of monkey see, monkey do. It's when an Indian chief works his whole life to get the feather in his cap, and has gone through all the rituals and all of the things expected, and then finally earns that feather. It's completely different than some girl that puts a feather in her cap and goes partying in the club all night. To me, that seems a little bit insensitive.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I think there's common ground there in that, for sure. You can't just do it, right? Especially not like that. It has to be tasteful. And I think you're right in that, in this picture, our prime minister is taking some liberties. Just as a personal example, in Thailand, this gesture is called the Y. And it's like a greeting, right? You say like hello, thank you, things like that. And it's not considered offensive. If I were to do it as a white man, it's a sign of respect.
But the problem is we don't have the time to study a culture. We're not anthropologists to do everything tastefully and respectfully. Then we end up just imitating the things that we see. So we're going to end up stepping on people's toes. So I think in order to avoid doing that, we should just sort of stick to our own culture and let them kind of learn something about us.
I see. Okay. And what about, like, your example is pretty drastic, and then you say like a girl taking a feather and going clubbing, whereas I was talking about, like weddings and things like that, where it's context that merits it.
Well, truthfully, I'm on your side of the argument. And I think that, our job in life is not to kind of train everybody in how to behave when they're around us. I think that's a really narcissistic and kind of thin-skinned way to go through life. It's like, when you're around me, you have to understand all my sensibilities and what offends me and all this. No, I think it's a better idea just for us to become strong and thick-skinned so that anyone can do anything or dress any way they want around us and it won't bother us at all. Because if this were true, then should we make all the business people in Asia take off their English business suits? You know what I mean?
Right. There's this somewhat, beautiful thing about learning some other culture and appreciating it. Like, and I can understand that firsthand, having lived in Thailand. Not that I've, dressed in traditional Thai clothing, but I don't think it makes sense if it's done with respect to brand that offensive.
Yeah. When I lived in Korea for a couple of years, and my experience is anything that I do as an expat or as a non-Korean that resembles Korean gesture, language, clothing, anything is much appreciated by Koreans. They love it. They really make a big deal when you try anything Korean. So just by their reaction, it makes me think that it is a flattery to them.
Yeah, I think definitely that the cultural appropriation thing is it comes with good intention. Like the people telling you not to do that because you want to respect it. It comes from a place of respect. But I've also found that, living in Thailand, if I do my absolute best at speaking Thai, right, or something along those lines, everyone loves it because it's an effort. It's an attempt to connect.
But you know what I found in my travels, Emile? You know which country is the exception to the rule that we're just talking about? The USA. Because Americans, when they meet people who can't speak English perfectly, are offended.
Yeah.
I found Americans expect more from you, whereas Koreans, they will be clapping if you just say 3 words in Korean,
Absolutely. I think it comes from a Western mindset, the idea that it is offensive. And this is a generalization, of course, but I agree that it's a bit blown out of proportion, I would say.
And the other thing I wanted to bring to the conversation is, like in Korea, there's a Chinese population that lives in Korea, and so they've appropriated some of the food and recipes from Korean, but then added some of their own to create a brand new fusion hybrid of food, which is unbelievably good. And so there's a new food that has cropped because of cultural appropriation and culture blending, that if it were not allowed or not accepted, we wouldn't have this amazing food.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the great things to come out of the intermingling of cultures, right? Of course, it's important to preserve traditions, I would say. I think it's really important from like a historical, anthropological perspective. But there is beauty in that. There is beauty in intermingling as a species. And I don't think it should be a divide. Absolutely.
Okay. You ready for round 2?
Ready.
Okay. Now, as we talked about, these are the topics that you brought to the table. And you're the first guest of mine to say, hey, I want to talk about my stuff. So you're putting me on the spot. So at the very
least, I think they're great topics, Tamer. I think they're really interesting.
Interesting, no doubt. But I'm going to go first so that I can at least speak my conscience on these matters.
Please.
All right. So the first question is trophy hunting, which already is offensive to me, that term. So you know which side I'm going to take. A morally responsible method to employ for conservation. On its face, I think trophy hunting just doesn't seem moral at all. We talked about this, on its face, it just doesn't seem right. And then you look at these two people, the Trump sons, they go get driven around the savannah, and when they see a large game animal, the driver stops, they point their gun, and they kill it, and then cut off its tail for a trophy. Does that seem right? It doesn't seem morally correct. I remember Donald Trump lifted the ban that Obama put in on hunting bears in their den while they're sleeping. Does that seem right to shoot a bear while it's sleeping in its den? Is it morally correct? I don't think so, because I think bears have a certain when they go to hibernate, they expect to sleep for a entire season. And if you start shooting them in their den, that's going to create a kind of anxiety for them to do what is in their nature to do. And that's certainly going to affect, I don't know, their genetic coding or their responses. It just seems like we're reducing animals to commodities and collectibles when we do this.
Yeah, and you make a good point, Tamer. Now, I want to say from a moral perspective, we are humans. This is our species, right? And while your points are valid, local populations, let's take Africa for an example, right? Let's take Namibia. There have been surveys done that say that 91% of like 160 local individuals say that they would not support a ban on trophy hunting because it funds their livelihoods, it's jobs, it's the leftovers are given to the communities for meat. And there are even like government programs where animals are auctioned off, and these are specific animals. You're not just driving around and shooting something. They're specific animals that are either aggressive or past the reproductive age, that are auctioned off for a ton of money. We're talking like hundreds and thousands of dollars to fund that thing, the trophy hunting, and then conservation takes that money.
You say that there are certain communities that are not opposed to trophy hunting because they benefit from the meat of a giraffe or a rhino that's been killed. But I get that, but couldn't the government step up and provide a real source of food for these communities? Like if they actually had a working government, couldn't we kind of eliminate the need for trophy hunting?
Well, I think because it's such a well-established thing now, and it's more than just food, right? Of course, it's livelihoods, it's jobs. It brings people there, and it funds, like let's say it reduces poaching as well, right? Because there's more regulation. There's conservation involved in that.
By hunting like this, when you hunt a trophy animal, you're looking for the best, the largest, the most magnificent specimen of that animal. And when you're hunting that animal for its prominent and adaptive features, aren't we kind of affecting the gene pool? Because the rhino with that horn, that needs a horn to fight off males and to attract females. If you hunt the biggest horn, the next generation is going to have a smaller horn.
So can I add to that?
Yeah, well, let's continue the conversation over here. Come on.
So and you make a very good point, because that was a concern. But what the government of Namibia, for example, is doing is they auction off individuals who are past reproductive age. So of course it's males, right? Because they have those traits, horns, tusks, and so on. And they auction them off only when they are large enough and old enough that they're not reproducing anymore, right? And they might actually be harming younger males who can still reproduce in terms of like male competition. And so by auctioning them off, they've already reproduced. Those genes for the best traits are passed on. The kids are being born, or the eggs are fertilized or whatever.
Oh, so I didn't know that. So it's not just like a random hunting spree when people do trophy hunting.
I mean, of course, there's some of that. There's some poaching involved, but the goal for conservation.
You say the poaching is reduced. Is it because when they allow trophy hunting, now the government wants to protect those animals for that lucrative trophy hunting contracts, so that they then take care of the poachers, or is it they turn, they no longer turn a blind eye to poaching? Is that what happens?
It's regulation, because if the government auctions off these animals, the wildlife, the habitat, right, where they are is protected more so than it would be if it was just free roam land and people would come, take a Jeep and go look for wildlife. So in that sense, poaching is reduced because there are more rangers involved, because there's more funding, right? When we say like you auction off, there was the example of a black rhino that was well past reproductive age that was auctioned off for, I think, something like $300,000, like ridiculous amounts of money. And that money goes into conservation at a national level, right? Not just one park or one conservation, organization. And so that gives jobs, that protects the habitat, that provides, food and livelihood and resources to better that environment and keep funding it. And of course, the argument is that we're not hurting the gene pool. We would just be hurting one animal. And so it's very utilitarian. That's the one. Thank you. Utilitarian.
So what is your actual feeling on this issue?
I honestly, it's a huge debate in the field, and it's as someone who loves conservation, it's really difficult for me to say you can kill that animal if it benefits the rest, because it's still from an individual suffering level. It feels wrong, right? Like we're talking about that intrinsic feeling. It feels wrong to say you can die. Why is it that just this one animal gets to die or has to die?
Yeah.
But for the benefit of the species, right? We're talking about on an evolutionary timescale. If we can protect the species from extinction or let them persist, it feels like something that might be necessary in this context, because the population is growing, humans are taking over more and more land, and that reduces habitat for wildlife. And so I do lean towards the fact that only if very well regulated with individuals past reproductive age, where the population's not being hurt, the gene pool's not being hurt, it's very like targeted and specific, I feel like that might be justifiable.
That's very interesting. That's very interesting. You kind of convinced me, like, because you seem very knowledgeable on the topic, and I'm sure you have good instincts for these things, but it's counter to intuition, and so I'm
Absolutely.
sure it would be a hard thing to sell to the general population, like the court of public opinion. But I'm sure somebody could do that. All right, let's move on to the next one. This next question is also one that you brought to the table based on your studies and the debates you're having at school. And the question is assisted migration a viable conservation strategy? And so what do we mean by assisted migration in the first place?
Yeah, so this means basically moving a species and choosing to move that species, and we're talking about the entire population, right? Or maybe even a subset of the population, because of the habitat where it's in currently not being suitable, or we know it's going to go extinct because of climate change or other factors, human related factors, right? We're talking about things that we have had a direct impact on, and we're moving them to save them. This is solely for the purpose. It's not for aesthetic purposes, or because we want elephants in North America or anything like that. This is specifically for the species, for the good of the species.
Okay.
So
okay.
Ideally.
All right. So I'm going to go first on this one, if you don't mind.
Please.
All right. To me, this seems like just another example of playing God. And even if our intentions are good, they say the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I mean, I think the main concern of moving a species into a place where they're not native is the threat of them becoming an invasive species. And maybe on the most basic level, we think about house cats and outdoor cats, and a lot of people in the neighborhood hate when their neighbors let their cats go outside, because a cat in a natural neighborhood in Canada, in a suburban Canada, is like a complete invasive species. And anyone who enjoys watching the blue jays and the cardinals and the hummingbirds now will get a cat, swapping them out of the air. It's not even interested in eating them. It's just purely a hunter. And so it's an invasive species. In my neighborhood alone, this thing called an Asian beetle appeared in the crates from delivering food and stuff. And the Asian beetle demolished all the ash trees in our neighborhood. They had to come and cut down gigantic trees that were there for decades because of this one beetle that appeared in our ecosystem.
Yeah, no, and the cat is actually, it's a huge argument in conservation because of how much of an issue cats are. But my point to that is, while yes, the threat of invasive species is an issue, what if the species is going extinct? What if, let's say, it's a species that is on a mountain, right? And it's getting warmer, so it's going up the mountain because the temperatures are cooler. And at some point, there's no more mountain. And so it's going to go extinct because it's almost like surrounded by this cesspool underneath the mountain of conditions that it cannot live in. And so it cannot leave. It can't go down the mountain to go somewhere else, because by the time it gets down there, it's done, right? And so if that is our doing, if climate change is directly driven by us and our actions, are we not morally responsible to save these species? Because it's literally directly our actions making them go extinct. And then beyond that, there are benefits to having species
are we
around,
not
right?
morally responsible to protect the existing species in a certain area? Because when you bring another species into that area, aren't we restricting the native species' ability to access their resources? And aren't this new species out competing them for the resources?
There's absolutely a possibility. And so this is where analysis and understanding the species itself comes in, right? Let's say there is an area of an ecosystem that is untapped. imagine a plant with longer roots, and there's, resources at the bottom, where all the native plants have shorter roots. That's an untapped resource that new plant could take and therefore not be invasive, right? So this is where understanding the species and understanding where you're putting it. It's not random. We're not just moving it.
We have zebra mussels that appeared in our Great Lakes in Canada.
Yeah.
Now it's overtaking the entire ecosystem, and this is just one little animal that got here by accident. If we replace an entire ecosystem with different animals, aren't they going to bring diseases that the other animals are not immune to?
Yeah, that's absolutely a good argument as well. And the zebra mussels is, once again, you've done your research. It's
Thanks for the cheat sheet. I appreciate it. No, I did not study biodiversity to prepare for this. I just had a cheat sheet from Emile. So
you're doing very well, Tamer.
Thanks.
See, I think the debate also rests a bit on this idea of preserving ecosystems as we understand them, right? So think like elephants are in Africa or Southeast Asia, and a moose is in North America or sometimes Northern Europe and things like that, right? So there are areas or habitats, geographical locations that we assign to species based on our knowledge for the last, couple centuries, right? As a modern species. And so one of the arguments for assisted migration is we have to break this idea of a species belongs here. Yes, there are native species, but if global biodiversity is improving, or we're maintaining global biodiversity by not losing species, this idea of pristine habitats, keeping them the way they are, doesn't make sense if we're letting species die and we're letting them go extinct, right? That's one of the big points of
let me ask you this, Emile, because we always assume the premise of we cannot let a species go extinct is what we all agree on, but is it? Because if the dinosaurs did not go extinct, would we be here? Like when a species goes extinct, it creates kind of an opening for other species to evolve, like a new, biological landscape. And so we wouldn't even be here if that species didn't go extinct.
And that is absolutely possible. And I think that's where, evolution tinkers and things like that, natural selection plays a role. But when we as a species, in all our, intelligence and consciousness and morals, if we know we are directly responsible for extinction, it's not always positive. A species can disappear and actually affect multiple other species of different taxonomic orders, from plants to bugs, to invertebrates, to apex predators. Let's say, a species of small mammal disappears, it goes extinct, and this has happened. Its predator disappears too, or declines. And then the predator beyond that disappears and declines. And then the plants are overabundant because the small mammal who is feeding on those plants now is no longer there to control that population. This is what's known as a trophic cascade in the field. So one thing disappears and all the things are out of proportions now. And that actually hurts the entire ecosystem. But this is one of those issues within conservation as well. Yes, it can open up a space, but can also leave a gaping hole.
Right. Is global warming and climate change man-made? Is that something that is a large contributor to extinction of species?
Absolutely. So I think it depends. I know that it's a factor, but it's
during COVID, people just started driving less, and all of a sudden the world seemed to start healing itself. The earth, and like the ozone layer, started coming back together, and the fish replenished, and the lakes got clean. Does it stand to reason, if we figured out how to eliminate fossil fuels and start using fusion energy and cell packs for limitless clean energy, do you think that the world would then grow over like a jungle again, and new species would be protected and come back, and the plants would thrive?
I think that's a very idealistic vision. I think it'd be great. Fossil fuels are a huge issue, and there's no denying it. But I don't think that it would make us grow over like a jungle again, right? We're still humans, and we have our creature comforts. But I think in terms of climate change, it would absolutely reduce those temperatures, which would lead to less natural disasters, less rising sea levels. Something, for example, a big part of climate change is ocean acidification, wherein carbon dioxide is dissolved into the water and it forms acid. by reacting with oxygen. It's a type of acid, and that hurts corals, right? It hurts fish. It hurts the entire aquatic ecosystem because the acidity of the water is then too low, which means too acidic, right? The pH is too low. And so that would absolutely help preserve that biodiversity. But it's just a factor, right? Overfishing is a huge issue with that as well. It depends on the individual species. We're not at a point where ocean acidification is killing off fish, but we're getting there. And this is where stepping in now matters. And this,
But do you
this
think
applies,
that
of course, to
like,
terrestrials.
how's your general feeling? Are you optimistic that the small group of people that cares about this is going to solve the issue for the large masses of people who don't even think about it?
If I'm being honest, not really.
So you think we're doomed?
It's an uphill battle, and there is time, and everyone is still like the field is hopeful. It might be a bit of a naive hope, but it's I firmly believe that it's not the consumer that has the impact. You know, it's not because you don't recycle your plastic bags that the world is ending. I think it plays a part.
But the
It absolutely
consumer
does.
in the grocery store, the consumer can choose the Granny Smith apple that was shipped in from South Africa or the Macintosh that was grown in our backyard. Isn't that a consumer choice that will help the planet?
It is. It is. It absolutely is. But it has to be at such a large scale where those apples are no longer shipped, right? And unfortunately, we are a long ways away from that because there's still demand, right? Because there's, you know, it doesn't seem as severe in your day to day, especially living somewhere like North America where we don't get, you know, floods, or at least here in Toronto, right? Or we don't get, you know, hurricanes weekly or earthquakes or things like that. And so we're very fortunate in that sense to be kind of blinded from it. But if you think of like, you know, in Bangladesh, for example, there were monstrous floods that completely decimated the coastal area because of rising sea levels, right? And the towns were destroyed and crops were killed off, and we're starting to see that slowly. You know, like for example, with the war in Russia and Ukraine, is not climate change related, but Ukraine was put out of commission. There was a shortage of grain and therefore bread, and the whole world was affected. Even though, again, we were fortunate enough to not have felt
And
it
that's
as
why we had
drastically
that
as other
really
places.
weird. All of a sudden, everyone agreed to let the grains go through. I guess because you know, it was really strange. I remember thinking, how is it that possible that they're allowing the grain harvest to happen? I guess because it was international pressure, because it became an international issue.
Yeah. And so when it gets to that point, right, there is political movement to further it or help it or so on. But because we're not at that point with climate change,
it's always the same.
At least not in the Western world, right? Again, this is the issue. That we haven't actually put our feet down or our foot down and just, you know, gone and helped it further.
Okay. All right. Thank you. That was a really educational. Yeah, I love it. I love it seeing you kind of in your element and talking your stuff. All right.